I keep on looking at this stuff and thinking, my goodness, I mean, these people are really pretty ticked off. And yet the left parties are pretty committed to doing the things that tick people off. Hello out there in podcast land. Welcome to a new edition of the Liberal Patriot podcast. I'm your host, Rui Teixeira. And I come at you every couple of weeks, bringing you the very finest in heterodox political conversation and analysis. We strive to have the most interesting and stimulating guests. And we have today, I'm very pleased to say, Sheri Berman, who is one of the premier experts on the European left and the left in general. Now, Sheri is a professor of political science at Barnard, which you may have heard there's some stuff happening there. She's a prolific writer on the evolution and state of the left, and she's also author of the seminal study, The Primacy of Politics, Social Democracy, and the Making of Europe's 20th Century, which I just could not recommend any more strongly to people. I mean, if you are at least even vaguely notionally on the center left, you really need to read this book, and everyone else should too, even if you're not. And then more recently, she's the author of Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe, from the Ancien Regime to the present day, pretty pertinent to current debates about democracy, and also an extremely fine book. So that's by way of introduction. You want to add anything to that, Sheri, or should we just get right into it?
Sounds great. Thank you for the kind words.
No problem. You know, I love to promote the people who I think are great, and I think are great. So anyway, a warm TOP welcome to you, Sheri. Let's start by talking about social democracy. What is it? Where did it come from? And how did it get so successful? And I think that's a story that maybe a lot of people don't quite understand. Maybe you could walk us through just the basics of how that happened.
Great. I would love to do so. So social democracy is a particular version of or faction on the left. It grew out of some big debates within the international socialist movement at the end of the 19th century about both capitalism and democracy. And the debates concerned with regards to capitalism, whether or not capitalism was doomed to collapse based on its inefficiencies, its amoralism, its tendency towards internal contradictions, and also whether or not the left should be happy about the potential end of capitalism. And then the other question that was really up for debate in the late 19th century as European countries were beginning a very difficult journey towards democracy was what the left's view of democracy should be. Was it simply a kind of bourgeois institution that didn't have, a central function for the left? It was better than authoritarianism, perhaps, but not a central goal of the left. Or should the left be central to what or should democracy rather be central to what the left strove for, and also seen as the most effective tool for achieving its goals? And so what distinguished social democracy from its competitors, Marxism, Leninism, was a belief, first of all, that capitalism was not going to collapse, and that regardless, it was possible to maximize its upsides and minimize its downsides. That is to say, social democrats recognized that capitalism had some very important benefits. It was the most effective engine for delivering growth, and it was also an incredibly effective engine for delivering innovation. And these were things that could improve the lives of workers in very important ways. And then they believed that you could use the democratic state to do that. That is, to maximize its upsides and minimize its downsides. And so for social democrats, capturing that democratic state came to be really important because they thought that was the way for them to begin to not only control, but to potentially remake capitalism. And I should also say that distinctive was not just the idea of democracy as a tool, as a means, but also as an end. Social democrats believed in democracy. They believed that it was crucial because it represented the best things about what the left stood for: people's ability to choose their own leaders in governments, a system that would allow them to make individual choices in their own lives based on their own goals and their own priorities. And so this really, again, was the sort of, the core of social democracy, a belief in democracy and a belief that capitalism's downsides could be minimized and upsides could be maximized. That remained, again, the vision up through the post-war period.
Right. Now, the post-war period is when this whole way of doing things on the left and the sort of ability to move capitalism in this direction really comes into its own, and was, well, quite successful. So do we really, do people not quite appreciate maybe the role of the left and social democracy in making this happen and just how damn successful it was?
I would say yes to both parts of those questions, which is to say that I would say yes. The kind of relationship between capitalism and democracy that we got after World War II and beginning in the United States with the New Deal, right, was very much a distinctively social democratic vision. That doesn't mean that it was only social democrats in Europe who implemented that. There were, of course, other parties that were in power, but this was a social democratic view of the relationship between these things, and really very much pushed by parts of the left, again, starting in the late 19th century, but with particular fervor during the interwar period and then right afterwards, right? So I think, it's important to recognize that this vision was very distinctive and very much associated with this group. But more importantly, I think the latter part of your question is really important, which is I think we have forgotten how much of a change this was from what existed before 1945. I mean, this idea that capitalism could be dangerous if left alone, that capitalism was prone to crises, that it could produce all kinds of negative consequences, inequality, insecurity, that could lead people to support extremism, and that could undermine democracy, that it was important for governments to be able to show citizens that they could, that is to say, governments and leaders could protect them from these negative consequences, that all of these things, these were not accepted before 1945. They were very much contested, as I said, promoted by a social democratic left, but not accepted. What really changes to some degree in the United States in the 1930s and then in Western Europe after 1945 is that this view really becomes accepted across the mainstream center left and center right. And it really has an incredibly powerful role in reshaping both the way economies were structured after 1945 in Western Europe and the views people had of what the correct role of government in both the economy and society was. So a very, very significant change. And I think we have forgotten both how significant a change that was and here's another important point, related but not the same, how important that change was in stabilizing democracy during the post-war period in Western Europe. And I would argue, even though the threat to democracy was much less, in the United States with the New Deal. Roosevelt, for instance, very much understood what he was doing is not just fixing the flaws of American capitalism, but protecting American democracy from its critics on both the left and the right. Yeah,
so I mean, it's a beautiful record. It's a beautiful song to sing. I like to sing it myself, but my goodness, what happened? It seemed like things were going so well, and then you hit the 1970s and beyond, and it all kind of falls apart. And the social democrats and the left in general, and really the Democrats as their representative here, is the same thing roughly. Why did that successful model and that successful approach cease to define the social democrats and the left? What happened? Was it just, did they make a mistake? Or was this sort of just inevitable given the changes in the structural circumstances they had to deal with? Because capitalism was changing, globalization was hitting, lots of things were happening. So did they kind of blow it, or was it just, this is what you were going to get given the change situation? Right. So that's obviously the sort of $64,000 question for moving forward. I would argue that none of this was inevitable and that there were a series of factors that came together to begin to corrode that social democratic model or that social democratic understanding of the relationship between capitalism and democracy. One, the most obvious, was that Western economies began running into a series of problems in the 1970s, economic problems, the dreaded stagflation, a combination of
slowing growth, higher unemployment and inflation. And these were real economic policies. And the policies that had characterized, or some of the policies that had characterized the social democratic model up to them, seemed to not be working well anymore. They were designed, as you sort of intimated, for an economy that was no longer, was by the 1970s already had changed significantly. Now, I mean, the question is then why didn't the left have policies to replace that, right? So if the underlying economic conditions change, right, the policies themselves should not have been that important, right? You should change your policies as the underlying economic dynamics change. And so why didn't the left have policies to deal with those changing conditions? I would say there were a couple of factors that are important there. One is that I think, people's time horizons are relatively short, and everybody began to think, sort of we've solved the problems, right? Things are stable. And I think a lot of the people who rose to the top of parties of the left during the post-war period became sort of more technocratic, to use a term that we use today, party managers, rather than the kinds of theorists and union people and people from the labor movement who had dominated these parties in the past. And these were people who were very good at sort of managing, but not necessarily, what you might be called innovators. The second obviously important factor on the left is what happens in the 1960s, right? So you get in the 1960s this groundswell of opposition, not just to Vietnam, obviously very important, but to the continuing deficiencies in Western democracies. And this is obviously an incredibly important and progressive movement, but it has some one might say negative consequences. One of them that we are still, sort of dealing with today, or one consequence of them that we're dealing with today, is very much a turn on the left away from the prioritization of economic challenges and problems to social and cultural ones. So much of the left's political and intellectual energy, starting in the 1960s, goes to dealing with some very significant, important, obviously, social and cultural challenges, and not really prioritizing a focus on those economic problems that were growing, having very negative consequences, not just for Western economies, but for that coalition of voters that had hitherto been, the foundation of left parties. So I would say on the left, you get a combination of sort of a lack of thinking about economic change and how to deal with it that's caused by this sort of confluence of a growing number of kind of technocrats managing these parties and leftist intellectuals who are not really focused as they would have been decades earlier on capitalism and its, sort of consequences as their main focus. And then, of course, you have, parallel to that, taking advantage of all of this, a very well-organized right that had been thinking for the long term, had been thinking, in fact, during that post-war period, very much about how much it disliked this social democratic compromise, but it was unable to get any intellectual or political traction until some of these problems began to emerge in the 1970s. So at the same time as the left was kind of turning away from dealing with some of these issues, you had a right that was well prepared intellectually and politically to take advantage of that and really began to do a great job in that period, culminating, I would say, in the 1990s, in getting its ideas institutionalized within the economics profession, within important think tanks, among crucial political figures, and therefore really able to take advantage of the left's inability to address economic problems to put forward its own view of the correct relationship between capitalism and democracy that was in many ways antithetical to that pursued by social democrats during the post-war period.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting to think about the ways in which the right has evolved in response to the changes on the left and the changes in capitalism. I mean, initially, I think they got some headwind because of the convergence. So, you've talked about this between the economic approaches of the right and the broad left and broad right, and it allowed them to, kind of steal a march on, by raising the salience of other issues, or other issues come to the fore, right? And they can be the party that's speaking to people's cultural and social discontents, because, cultural issues by definition come to the fore if the main parties don't really seem to disagree that much in economics. They can take advantage of that. But then a further development that you talk about very interestingly in some of your recent writings is the way not only are they sort of positioning themselves in a sociocultural sense in a way to pick up on a lot of this working class discontent, but they're actually moving in a direction of co-opting some of the economic issues as well, because they're the guardians of the welfare state. They're the people who don't think the working class should get the shaft, and on and on and on. And it's fascinating to see how well this is going for them in some ways. And then another component of their master plan is how they've, I don't know if it was a plan, but they've moderated in some important ways. They obviously they got part of their wedge in was these cultural issues, but they realized that to really be get as many votes as they can and be as serious a player as possible, they have to present a somewhat more moderate image. They have to not seem so scary. And you argue that that's a big part of their appeal today, that they managed to become a party that can be considered seriously within the context of standard democracy, whereas that was not the case a number of decades ago. So maybe walk us through that. I just think it's such a fascinating evolution, and something I think is not really well understood.
So I think it's very important. There's a lot of folks who focus on the left, and there's a lot of folks who focus on the right, scholars, commentators, and citizens. You have a tendency to kind of look at your own part of the political spectrum, but really the only way to understand both sides of the spectrum, and in fact, sort of the broader dynamics of what's going on in our political systems, is to think about the ways these groups or these parties interact, right? So we just talked about the fact that, the inability of the left to articulate new policies to deal with changing capitalism, to new policies to help the democratic state, manage capitalism without killing the goose that laid the golden egg, opened up an opportunity for folks on the right to put forward their own views about this, right? About their own views about how, governments and markets the relationship between governments and markets, about the nature of capitalism, all these kinds of things. So as you mentioned, right, if we want to understand the evolution of what you might call populist right, I would say both in Western Europe and the United States, you really have to look at the exchanges between the intellectual and political and voting exchanges between these two sides of the political spectrum. So as you said, in Western Europe, actually, Western Europe is in some ways kind of ahead of the United States in some of these changing dynamics for a variety of reasons. If you look at the sort of origins of right-wing populism in Western Europe, you started to see the growth of parties of this nature, around this time. I would say more in the 80s, than the 1970s, right? You begin to see a bunch of new parties coming in on the right at this point. And again, they're taking advantage of the sort of disruption in politics and economics that's going on during this time. But if you look at the parties that emerged during this time in the 1980s on the right, they have the following profile. They tend to be quite conservative on economic issues, right? Thatcherite or Reaganite, right? So that was their stance on economics. Smaller state, cut taxes, welfare state bad, regulation bad, all these kinds of things. And they tended to be really quite radical, right? That is to say, they were profoundly illiberal. They were often openly racist, anti-Semitic, very questionable commitments to democracy. These parties tended to get relatively low vote shares. There just was not a huge constituency for, the Jean-Marie Le Pen's of this world.
Yeah, it was a limited market.
Right, an open Holocaust denier charged more than once by the French state, and again, who very much presented himself as a Reaganite and Thatcherite, right? So he could ride waves of dissatisfaction, but his appeal was capped by, again, the fact that he was just considered to be really beyond the pale, both for voters and for other parties, which limited his ability to win presidential elections. And so what do we get in France as well as in some other places, right? So in France, it's the most dramatic example, right? We literally get a palace coup by his own daughter who pushes him out and begins to really transform that party. And she transforms it in two very important ways. One, she moderates the party's image, right? So now instead of open racism and anti-Semitism, she says, look, our opposition to immigration is really all about an unwillingness to assimilate, to accept French values and traditions, and because these people are a burden on our welfare state and, our budget. Right. So, changing the way in which she presents the problems of immigration from, ethno-nationalist to something, more acceptable. And she also very much moderates her party on economic issues to the point where most scholars now place the National Front, now renamed the National Rally, on the center left. What does that mean? So strong advocacy of the welfare state, very significant suspicion of globalization, trade, very much for a stronger state capable of regulating the economy, protecting the left behinds, yada, yada, yada. And this has turned the National Rally into the largest working class party in France. Now, this is kind of an exemplar of this trend, but you can very much see this in other places as well. That is to say, a sort of combination of moderating on the sort of democratic side. Yeah, that is to say, no more, sort of questioning the democratic rules of the game, no more open racism and anti-Semitism. And in many of these parties also a shift to the center or even the center left. And this has really enabled them to take advantage of the kind of voting shifts that began in the 1980s and over the course of a generation begin to capture growing numbers of low income, low educated voters, the people, sort of sometimes referred to as the left behinds. And this was very
Can't
much...
you map the Communist Party support in France onto former Communist Party support onto National Rally support?
I mean,
at this
absolutely.
point, it's 1-to-1.
Yes. I mean, the French case is a little extreme in the sense that both the Communist Party, which was a dominant force on the left, and the Socialist Party have essentially collapsed. So, a lot of the groups that would have formally voted for the Communist Party, which was really the party of the working class in France, I mean, that party's just gone. And many of those, many working class, low educated voters are now National Rally voters. That is true in a lot of other parts of Europe as well. And it's very difficult to understand both the voting shifts and the changing profiles of the populist right without looking at the kinds of things that the left was doing. I would say that what we're seeing right now in the United States is a very pale but not entirely different version of what we saw in Europe, right? Which is the Republican Party has grown over time, but increasingly so under Trump, dependent on low income, low educated voters. But it has historically been a party whose economic policies have dramatically favored not those voters. That is to say, been dramatically skewed towards wealthy individuals and business. Now, you can try to trick these voters, or not trick them. You can try to distract them, let's say, by playing to their social and cultural resentments, concerns, whatever, yada, yada. But over time, if you want to cement this new coalition, you have got to do something more than rail against China and free trade, right? You have to give them some economic policies that can actually speak to their real and pressing economic concerns. And so what we've seen over the last years is some really strong, not by any means dominant, but not insignificant voices within that right part of the spectrum in the United States calling for an economic reorientation precisely to fit the party, the Republican Party, better to what its actual voting base is clearly becoming.
Yeah, no, I think that's very interesting. As you say, these voices are still a little bit lonely within the party, but they're there and they're significant, and there's some really smart, interesting people behind it. And sort of the logic of the situation just should propel them in that direction to take that more seriously. One thing that I'm curious about, you wrote, I think, a very interesting article, a couple articles maybe about the left. We talked about how these bright populist parties have become successful in Europe by moderating and becoming, in a sense, more good democratic players. But there's a tendency to dismiss these parties still as being fascist, or to use Biden's phrase, semi-fascist. And that's kind of a mistake, and I agree with that. But then you look at the United States and you see the evolution of the Republican Party is different. It goes from being a really standard issue Democratic player to seeming to break those norms. So going in the opposite direction, even as it picks up working class support. So, what do you think of the argument that, well, okay, maybe those parties, in Italy or France or whatever, they aren't fascist, but, God damn it, the Republican Party really is, or they're becoming one because they are moving in this different direction. What do you think about that?
So let me say two things to that. One is by sort of by noting that some of these right-wing populist parties have moderated. I'm not suggesting that all of them have, right? So the most notable, and I would say worrying exception in Western Europe right now, is the AfD, which is really quite a radical anti-democratic party that harbors some clear out and out, racists. There's simply no doubt about that. And we can talk about why that party has managed to flourish in Germany if you or your voters are interested. So I want to say that this is not true of all right-wing populist parties, but it is a very palpable trend. And I think that even for folks on the left, this is something that we would want to encourage, right? Which is to say, it's one thing to deal with parties whose policies we don't like. Stricter, perhaps, you're not all in agreement on, stricter limits on immigration, or you don't like traditional, values, or you're, more pro-EU or more pro environmental legislation than these parties are. That is all fine. And that is totally legitimate. But it's one thing to say, look, I really vehemently disagree with your policies. And it's another to say, look, you are not playing by the democratic rules of the game. You are actually actively trying to undermine them. So I think that that's an important difference that the left has to keep in mind, right? Which is, it's one thing to be dealing with an anti-democratic or an undemocratic actor, right? It's another thing to be dealing with parties whose policies you disagree with vehemently. It's very important to make that distinction. And I think calling parties fascist when they are not actively trying to undermine the rules of the game, when they are not advocating ethno-nationalist policies, that kind of thing, I think that is both wrong, and I think it is counterproductive. I think what we have in the United States, as you said, is an interesting case of a party that's gone from conservative to radical. That is to say, in the opposite direction from what some right-wing populist parties in Europe have become. That is indeed very, very dangerous. And I think that, again, we could talk a little bit more about why the trajectories have been different. But I would not call the Republican Party fascist, because as a scholar of the interwar years, I really don't like throwing around terms that have a very specific meaning, to be equivalent even to an anti-democratic actor. I mean, I don't think, there are a lot of examples of authoritarian regimes that were not fascist, and I think fascism means something very particular. So I would not use that term, but I think there's simply no doubt that the Republican Party has, as you said, gone from conservative to radical. And by radical, I mean, not only, but most importantly, perhaps, in a way that is willing to undermine the democratic rules of the game to achieve political success.
Thinking more about the populist backlash, I mean, one thing that has really caught my eye recently is, and this is obviously clearly true in Europe, and I think it's a factor here as well, is the backlash against sort of green policies, right? Net zero, restrictions on this, that, and the other thing. Everybody should get an electric vehicle and a heat pump. This stuff is like really unpopular with a lot of working class voters. And my sense is that populist parties in Europe have really picked up on this and are using it to great effect. And obviously it's a factor that's being debated here and that annoys a lot of working class voters. So, I mean, what's that about, right? I mean, it does seem like that's sort of almost an economic plank it's both an economic and cultural stance of the left these days that, not only do we have to save the planet, but if we do it, we'll all benefit, it'll be great, everyone will have a great job, blah, blah, blah. But people don't seem to be buying it. So, in a way, that's a way, I guess what I'm saying is that's a way in which the parties, the right populist parties in Europe have not become center-left on economics, if that in fact is part of being center-left, which we could debate. But I think, how big a deal do you think this is? I guess I'm asking, because, I keep on looking at this stuff and thinking, my goodness, I mean, these people are really pretty ticked off. And yet the left parties are pretty committed to doing the things that tick people off.
Yeah, no, you're right in the sense that this has become a very big issue in Western Europe. And I think both parts of what you said are important, right? I think at the base of this is an economic conflict. That is to say that, West European economies are not doing as well as the American one is. There is some real suffering on the part of low income and low educated workers. There are significant budgetary constraints. And at this point, therefore, imposing essentially new burdens on people who feel themselves very, very economically insecure. That's just, it's just a recipe for disaster, right? It just is, because they just simply do not have the resources to make these kinds of changes. And so governments should it was predictable if unpredicted, right? Which is to say that putting these burdens on folks when they feel that they just do not have the ability to take them on was bound to create a backlash. I mean, we saw that in the yellow vests, right? A few years ago, that was precisely, sort of the crux of the matter. We see that in a different way in farmers' protests now, that is to say, the imposition of environmental and other kinds of regulations on farmers who are very, very close to the edge economically. So I think the foundation here is an economic conflict. That is to say, a burden that a lot of sectors of society feel they are simply unwilling to, or unable rather, to bear. I would like to point out, though, that the sort of climate denialism that pervades parts of the right in the United States is not quite really that strong in Western Europe. It's not so much that people don't think that protecting the environment is important. I think what they very much are rejecting is a sense that they cannot bear the burden of that. So there is an economic conflict there, but also, as you said, important is that parts of the populist right have worked very much, because it's to their advantage to do this, to portray this also as a kind of cultural conflict, right? That this is a set of policies coming from, educated elites, green politicians who represent those educated elites, Brussels bureaucrats who are just simply out of touch with the burdens and the needs that ordinary folks have. So on top of the sort of economic conflict, you get layered on this sense that these policies are being pushed by people who are just simply out of touch with the needs of ordinary citizens. So you have this kind of noxious mix of an economic conflict and a social cultural conflict that really does, sort of benefit right-wing populists, because they really thrive on this, this sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, looked at the other way, I mean, not only does this not land well with some of these voters, and right populists are taking advantage of it, but these are real commitments and sort of cultural / economic commitments on the part of these left parties that is, much more so than they would have been 20 or 30 years ago. And, this connects to my, I guess, broad question about what is the ability of, as you put it in one of your articles, excellent article, can social democracy save the world again? Because you're advocating, and I agree, it would be better if these parties sort of recentered themselves around the economic interests of the, working and middle class, and sort of dialed down, their, sort of their commitment to some more boutique cultural and social issues, and just were more willing to compromise and more willing to be in the wheelhouse of these voters and put the emphasis again on the things where they really might have a comparative advantage and that would really speak to people's concerns. But, as Thomas Piketty has argued and shown, and, his colleagues, you look at the evolution of these parties, and they become more Brahmin left parties than working class parties. You mentioned the National Rally is now the working class party in France, not the socialists and communists, and obviously not Macron. But so, is it even possible at this point for these formerly, or still, they call themselves social democratic, and these Brahmin left parties really become what you advocate, because they are sort of dominated by their new constituencies that are more well off and particularly more educated and certainly quite a bit more liberal on a lot of these issues, and just have a different set of priorities. Is this really feasible, or are we kind of like stuck?
So, I mean, that's a great question. I think it's important to note that this shift in the sort of voting base and profile of left parties has been, the result of several decades of change, right? So, this is not something that happened since Trump in the United States or in the last 10 years in Europe. I mean, this is a change that's been going on specifically since the 1990s, right? So the roots are even earlier. We talked about the 70s and 80s, but you really begin to see in the 1990s, some very significant changes again, and where voters, what kinds of voters are voting for what parties, and, sort of some very dramatic shifts. So I think one thing that's important to note is this is not the kind of transition that happened overnight, and it's not the kind of transition that, should one want to reverse it, can also happen overnight, right? So at this point, in the United States, voters associate the Democratic Party with X, and they associate the Republican Party with Y. That is not going to change overnight. Now, if one wanted to change that, one would have to, I think, commit to a long-term process of change akin to what the right did. I mean, the right managed very carefully and I would say strategically to change the way voters viewed parties and viewed themselves, viewed their relationship with their, fellow Americans in ways that ended up really dramatically benefiting the right. So, if the left really wants to become a party, a broad party of, working class and middle class voters, as opposed to a party of, in the United States, of a sort of educated elite and minorities, then that would require, I think, a recognition that this is going to take many years to change. I do think that the best way to do that would be by recentering the party's profile around economic issues, not because other issues are not important, but because the economic issues are the ones where you could get the broadest coalition, and that coalition is necessary, I think, if you want to be able to not only win elections, but do other kinds of things as well. I would also argue that the economic issues are really quite, the economic issues are the ones that have the most, punch, so to speak, which is, right, I think that they will not only solve, they will not only directly confront some of the very obvious economic problems that we have in our society, but actually would go not all the way, but a not insignificant way to ameliorating many of the other problems that we have as well, because dealing with poverty, dealing with lack of education to other opportunities is really quite central for improving the life outcomes of all underprivileged groups.
Yeah. Now, do you see green shoots here in terms of, I don't know, the broad left, the Democratic Party? I mean, some people argue the Biden administration has really taken a turn toward a sort of less or even anti-neoliberal policy. They're more concerned with trying to, invest in the country, make it more prosperous. He's pro-union. I mean, how big a deal do you think this is, or is this, isn't it at least a green shoot? I guess I'll say.
Well, look, I mean, my view of the Biden administration is that his administration has done about as good a job as one could expect, particularly given the constraints that he's faced. I mean, his economic policies, it's not a dream outcome. I mean, like if you had no constraints, would a person on the economic left wanted more? Sure. But I think, given that we're trying to live in a reality-based world, I think he has accomplished really a lot. And it's frustrating, I think, for a lot of us for that not to have had more of an impact on voters' perceptions of both the party and of the economy more generally. But, you do what you can and you hope that over time that makes a difference. I think, the Democratic Party right now is being battered by a lot of things that are hindering his ability to center that message as much as I assume he would like. I mean, one is obviously there's a focus on his age, which has become, sort of quite central. And then, of course, there's the social and cultural divisions within the party that have always existed. I would say were actually relatively well managed until this Israel-Gaza tragedy broke out. And then those divisions have just exploded again and really distracted attention, not surprisingly, away from the economic issues that should really be the bread and butter of the Democratic Party, and really just focused attention on things where the Democrats are, somewhat divided and where the Republicans are more united. And that's not great for electoral outcomes.
Yeah, well, talk about that. I mean, how big a break is this? I mean, as you pointed out, these sociocultural divisions within the party have been salient for a while. You could argue they've been a factor holding the party back, but they were sort of contained. And now the Israel-Gaza conflict and the sort of the activism around that, which has spilled out in all kinds of weird ways. Is this almost like a breaking point? And I guess one thing I'd also ask in relation to this, because I was thinking about this when you were talking about, we got to play the long game here. The left, it'll take you can't turn the battleship around overnight. So people need to be thinking about that long-term plan. Now, one could argue that the very people who should have been thinking about this long-term plan were the people in and around the Democratic Socialists of America, right? Who are the people who, sort of have this long-term commitment to a different kind of system. But, that seems to have gone by the board as DSA has evolved in weird directions. We're both, I think, ex-members at least. I'm an ex-member. You may still be, but you know what I mean. We've been in and around that movement, so it's disturbing to see how it's evolved, and disturbing to see the role at least some of these chapters have played in the debates and conflicts and demonstrations around Israel, Gaza. So, I mean, that's another indication it could be a bit of a break point, right? It's breaking part of the Democratic Party, and it's breaking the left. So maybe I'm exaggerating here. What do you think? How serious is this?
Well, I think you're right in the sense that this is kind of another manifestation, I think, of some important social and cultural divisions within the Democratic Party. I mean, sectarianism is never a giant vote winner, and so the more the Democratic Party becomes represented by folks or associated with folks who are really far from the mainstream, no matter how passionate or committed they are, I think the less good it is for the party's vote share. I mean, the question is it possible to come to some kind of compromise within the Democratic Party that would be both acceptable within the party, but also attractive to, the sort of broad coalition of voters that one's going to need to win in, November? I mean, look, Biden has on this issue, I think, shifted gradually, and there is a lot of pressure within the party from, I would say, traditionally more moderate elements for him to push Israel even more, to try to rein in, some of the unrein-inable aspects of Netanyahu's government. I think he needs to do that both for moral reasons and for electoral reasons. But there are clearly some people who are not going to be satisfied even with that. And the more that they withdraw from the Democratic Party by threatening not to vote, and the more that they become, the face of the party, however unfair that is, in the sense that they, remain a minority of Democratic voters, I think the more it will end up hurting the Democrats, if only because it continues to allow the Republicans to portray the party as kind of, extreme, which is generally not where American voters are. So, the ability to manage this conflict, this is going to be very difficult, but it is going to be, I think, really important as we get closer and closer to November.
Yeah, and beyond. Well, I can't let you go actually without kind of sounding you out on the demonstrations and activities roiling your campus. What's your take on all that? What have you observed? What have you seen? Or you're just trying to stay away from it?
I don't know. As a professor, it's really quite sad to see students essentially kind of at each other's throats. I don't see. I'm not upset with the passion at which some people feel. The passion of people on different sides of this issue. As a professor, it is really not my. It's not my job to comment on that. I feel like, we live in a democracy, and it is your right to feel and to protest and to talk about what you want. What saddens me really is just that the atmosphere on campus has become toxic.
It's as bad as it looks, in other words. To us from the outside.
Look, you can stay off campus and, walk around with your headphones. But I think for my students, it's very difficult because, again, even those who feel passionate on one side or another, what it's done is it's really estranged them from their fellow students. And I get it. You feel passionate, but there should be some room for dialogue. There should be some room for discussion. And there really hasn't been. And frankly, I think that is a real sign of some major problems that universities and faculty have had that have really borne fruit in this very difficult time.
Are you, does it bother you that, back to the DSA, they haven't played more of a role in kind of being a responsible, calming down influence in this situation?
I don't think DSA has been a calming down influence for quite a while.
Okay. We'll just leave that there. I kind of agree with that. It's an unfortunate evolution. Michael Harrington would be turning over in his grave, but there it is. Let's just zoom back out before we close and get your take on the European parliamentary elections that are coming up. I mean, I've been, following the polls on this, and it don't look good for our comrades in the Socialist and Democrats group.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think your assessment is pretty much everyone's assessment at this point. Very likely to see a significant gain for the right and for the far right in particular in those June's elections. I mean, insofar as polls mean anything, that's what's going to happen. We're going to see very strong gains for the right and the far right in particular. What that's going to mean is that, hitherto what you've had at the European level is a kind of, sort of grand coalition or domination of the, what is essentially the center-left parties and the center-right parties. If the polls hold, what we're likely to get now is a more clearly right-wing profiled leading group at the European level, and that will change dynamics. How exactly, it's hard to say, because it's hard to know what the issues will be, but it will change the dynamics, and it will shift the European Union's focus somewhat to immigration even more than it is, or perhaps shift it in different ways. And it will change the way, it will change the agenda, and it will change the way the European Union perhaps is governed. So yes, that's probably what's coming down the pike for the June elections.
Yeah. So stay tuned on all that. I mean, the left has its work cut out for itself there and here also, as we've been discussing. And, I can't recommend Sheri's work in this area enough. Have you got anything coming up for us, Sheri? A new book or a new essay that I can point our listeners to?
Well, I am going to try to write a book about these topics next year, so I'm looking forward to focusing on that. So hopefully our world will not have exploded by then, and there'll still be people interested in trying to figure out how to stabilize our democracies and improve the fortunes of the left.
Well, okay. I'll look forward to that. And until then, we'll just have to soldier on as best we can. So thank you, Sheri, for being on the Liberal Patriot podcast. This was great. I always learn a lot from you, and I hope our listeners did too. And I guess we'll just see you in a couple of weeks when I'm going to have Batya Ungar-Sargon on talking about her new book on class in the United States. But again, thanks, Sheri. And, I'd say I'd see you around campus, but I don't think I'm going to be going to Columbia anytime soon.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Super. Okay. Bye.